So my name is Leonard Woltering. I'm a scaling advisor at CIMMIT, one of the CGIAR centers, and also GIZ. I'm also one of the co-chairs of the agricultural working group. And today I'm moderating basically for one reason, because I think I'm the only person that can pronounce the speaker's name correctly. And that is Seerp Wigboldus. I don't think anybody can pronounce that so nicely. So yeah, it's a bit of a Dutch, a double Dutch day today, but yeah, you know that is the reason. So before I introduce him, just some housekeeping. Yeah, you're really welcome to turn on your camera. We are a small group, so I really like to have it interactive. Just keep your microphone muted. We have reserved quite some good time for discussion, so really look forward to your reactions. And hi, Judy. Hi, Florence. Nice to see you. Great. Now to Seerp. You can see him already in the screen. So Seerp has a background in social sciences and plant sciences, but actually he prefers the latter. He prefers the plant sciences. His PhD was on rethinking the idea and practice of scaling innovations, and that expresses his natural tendency towards thinking outside of the box and challenging common approaches. I think the title of your PhD was To Scale or Not to Scale. It's somewhere there, and I have it here. Very nice, very thought-provoking. And that's also how he came to coin the idea of responsible scaling. And at the same time, he's very open to revisit his own approaches and ideas and really have good discussions on this. Now, maybe a personal note, when I started working on scaling 6 years ago, I thought, oh my God, what is scaling actually? And one of the first people that I tried to meet was Seerp. And that was really very interesting because he guided me a lot in kind of the thinking around scaling. And I don't think I've seen any publication around scaling which doesn't refer to his work. So for me, it's really a very nice moment to have him here. And Seerp, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Leonard. It's a privilege to be here and to present before people who, some of who have had a much longer history already in this topic area than I have. So maybe I should just share my presentation and then take it from there. Is that okay? Let me make this work. Okay, good. So I will be sharing some thoughts with you, and as Leonard said, like, yeah, I sometimes try to challenge thinking, but maybe sometimes I go cut some corners where I shouldn't. And so this is also sharing some open thinking, sometimes thinking out loud, maybe things that you will say like, well, I'm not so sure about it, but that's the whole idea. You know, I like to poke a little bit into thinking around scaling, but this time I will focus particularly on this idea of capacities to scale innovations. So in this presentation, there's 5 parts. First of all, I'll say something to maybe kind of give a background before sharing some more critical thoughts and ideas to be clear where I'm coming from. And then I'll focus a bit more before I go into this capacity angle. I will focus on the last sentence of that publication that this is also related to, capacities to scale innovations for sustainable development. What that for sustainable development, how that is important to contextualize this capacity approach. So then I'll share some thoughts on the collective capabilities perspective, the general side of it, and then zoom in to how we apply this in 3 different settings in Africa. And I'll close with a number of key takeaway messages. So, you know, so I try to be constructively critical about various approaches in scaling, but I do recognize that scaling makes a lot of sense. You don't want to reinvent the wheel again. You don't want to create new ideas that are just not affordable unless it's applied at scale. And there's a lot of reasons why scaling makes sense. But there's a lot of questions also that I feel sometimes are not addressed sufficiently. And perhaps that's also based on what I would say, that there's a continuous tension between scaling, where there's issues of like, well, you reduce in a way a kind of diversity, you may be creating dependencies, and more ecological principles. I think there's a continuous tension where, and I will get back to it when we talk about resilience characteristics, where it relates to diversity, flexibility, etc. Scaling can also narrow things down in ways that actually may not be helpful for resilience. And yet it needs to play a role, and how to overcome the tension between those two. That's a bit of the challenge, I think. So for sustainable development, what I see happen a lot is that in the beginning, any kind of scaling project, it has a focus on the impact for which the scaling needs to play a role. But then gradually it becomes a focus, a purpose in itself. Just getting something to go to scale becomes the very thing to do, and losing sight of like, hey, but how was this meant to contribute to something bigger? So it's always the question should be, if this is becoming applied more widely, how will it affect sustainability? That's the general question then. So also I have a problem with this whole word of solutions, because I think a solution can only be a solution once it has solved something for some group somewhere for a different specific purpose. And solutions you cannot have on the shelf. So a solution has to prove itself, so to speak, again and again. And scaling then also means the solution that has been something that has been framed as a solution needs to prove itself again and again. So that's why we need to closely monitor also what happens when something is being applied at larger and larger scale, or more and more widely, and not assume that the more the merrier. This also relates to the context of sustainability transitions that I think sometimes become reduced to a selected scaling of selected, what are called solutions, where then the whole transition is about how those solutions, whether it's windmills or solar panels, and every sector has its own solutions, that it replaces the more complex change processes involved, and replaces or overtakes the whole focus of the sustainability transition. So then it becomes a marketing strategy, and some people will have vested interest in seeing those solutions becoming applied at wide scale, etc. And then it gets blurry. Why are we doing this actually? So I think that's something to be paying attention to, the role of scaling so-called solutions in those wider sustainability transitions. Well, I've shown this before also in the context of my PhD work, that scaling can cause, through selective scaling, you can lose diversity, you can blow things out of proportions, because making particular things more or bigger, and as a result other things get smaller or excessive. The example of the Aral Sea, where through scaling application of irrigation, a lake was drained, and this has happened in more places. So that's things to keep in mind also when we talk later more about capacity, and also the issue of like the short-term scaling perspective and the long-term. I had to think about I think it's the African saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. I think that also relates to diversity. It's easy maybe not so easy, but focusing on a few things and seeing those go to scale is easier to do than when there's a lot of things that somehow in relation to each other need to scale. And so because we've seen that also we've become more dependent on just a few crops and limited number of varieties. So yeah, there's a concern, of course, that we go for quick fixes rather than with the long-term sustainability. And how does scaling, as I said before, there's some tension between what we focus on in scaling processes and the more the ecological, agroecological processes. And of course, the financiers, the donors, they have a role to play, because sometimes, yeah, they push us to show results and to show that things go to scale, and they also need to create conditions for that. So we can learn from nature also the more the ecological perspective, and how we can work that into our scaling thinking. Maybe now there's a lot of business thinking that has inspired scaling thinking, and maybe we need to inspire it more by resilience thinking. And what I mean then is thinking about resilience characteristics such as diversity, redundancy, having some extra so you can handle shocks and stress, flexibility, robustness, connectedness. So how does scaling, how does it affect resilience? How does it affect vulnerability? It may be good on the short run, as I said before, maybe something good for the short run, but on the long run, will it make, say, farming systems, cropping systems more resilient? I think it's a useful reference to consider. Well, then there's some other things that we could think about, broadening the perspective of considering how how to engage with scaling processes, what happens to proportions, etc. Maybe I should just go forward. Yes, so this perspective that we developed, the capacity to scale innovations for sustainable development on relates to what's called the 5 capabilities approach, developed by Beza and Morgan in 2008. And those are, it's based on an idea of collective capabilities, where a group together has, among them, they share a number of capabilities to take certain activities, certain projects, certain efforts forward. And they've made some definitions on what you need. It was based on a large scale study, a large study of capacity building projects, and they came to these core capabilities that are central in that you need to have in collaborative efforts. The capability to relate, to achieve coherence, to generate development results, to adapt and self-renew, to survive and act. Well, these have been redefined a number of times by different authors, but they have also been applied. So I've been also involved in this in the context of landscape governance, applying those collective capabilities, considering how landscape actors together among themselves have the core capabilities to govern the landscape appropriately. Currently, we're applying it in the context also of living labs, and there we focus on living labs. A central feature, then we consider that they are about collaborative search and shared learning. So collaborative search that is also relatively open. So there we also apply this 5 capabilities approach in a bit different way of how those collective capabilities show or don't show in a living lab, and how also you can plan for engaging actors in the process to cover the needed capabilities. And so then I get to the study that we did with a number of colleagues in Africa, where we applied it to collective capabilities of partners in scaling. And I'll come back in a moment on this idea of partners in scaling and not scaling partners, so we're building there on those the 5 capabilities approach, the multi-level perspective, and scaling readiness that I assume that you're all familiar with. So yes, as I said, scaling partners is the more common approach, and this is how these projects that we were learning along the lines of scaling processes. We started off with thinking in terms of scaling partners that you engage because you have something that you'd like to see go to be applied more widely. And we ran into a number of problems that these partners had their own agendas, but also had their limitations. Anyway, there was for a lot of reasons we kind of got stuck and started to think about like maybe we need to approach these partners less as kind of helpful partners to in our party, so to speak, but engaging them more seriously as partners that we need to think about, like how would this work for sustainable development and how they would like to engage in the process, rather than that we have already predefined their role. This relates also to the scaling readiness that already points to the fact that there's so many actors and factors involved. It's not just scaling that particular technology innovation, but there's a lot of things around that technology that need to start to move. So that means, yeah, there's different. That's where the capabilities come in to see those things start moving. You need to work with different stakeholders, but also see how they can be then partners in the process, and not just as scaling partners, but partners in the scaling process itself. And I'll elaborate a little bit more. So this is more of a standard way of looking at the process, where there's research, there's the discovery, the innovation, and then there's this process of some transfer through intermediaries, scaling partners, innovation platforms, living labs, etc. And then you'd like to see things become applied at scale. And we were looking more, so I tried to present it in a graphic format, but it's maybe not showing all the elements of it, but seeing how these partners in scaling could broaden the way of engaging, and also be more open, so that it's not just, and I'll come back to that later, and not just one application at scale, but maybe different ways, the diversity in ways of how this is taken forward. Also maybe in ways that we had not envisaged beforehand, but creating opportunities for variations on a theme, which allows to be more partners, because otherwise, if you have all defined it beforehand, how this needs to go to scale, it also reduces the opportunities for partners to take it forward in the way they'd like to do it. So there's these 6 capabilities that we derive from the 5 capabilities approach. We define them more in the context of scaling processes, to relate and partner, to resource and act, to adapt and navigate, to balance diversity and coherence among the partners, and then also to make it work for development, as I spent a couple of slides on that. So also the capability to consider, not just to see how can this go to scale, but also that in the end it works for development results under different circumstances. And then since there's also somewhere you'd like to let it go, and that others take it forward, so how it can be anchored in institutions for continued scaling. Those were the ones that, after some deliberations and adaptations, we said, like, well, these are the key ones that we need to cover in a partnership, a scaling partnership. That's also how we could call it. We then try to see how do they relate to a multi-level perspective. You can read about it in the paper that we published on it. I will not go into the details. And what was very helpful in this context was also to consider, so how do we consider what kind of capabilities are needed along the lines of those 6 different ones? For instance, in the context of the case of high quality cassava peels in Nigeria. So this is an unpacking. The picture shows how we unpack using scaling readiness approach in its earlier versions. All the things that need to start moving and what it means for capabilities to engage with those variety of change processes. So that helped us to unpack the kind of capabilities needed. And then in terms of methodology, we defined further for each of those capabilities, some key dimensions. I'll show them quickly in a moment. And then in relation to those, we looked at the different cases and considered where they were at the beginning and and halfway and more towards the end in terms of that capability, whether that capability was very strong, and then we're talking about the collective capability. So it may be just 1 or 2 of the partners involved that are taking that particular role. It doesn't have to be that all of them need to be good at it, but among as a collective, how it's working out. So how it was at the beginning, how it changed over time, and also to see how it would help to inform also the process of, like, maybe we're missing important partners because the capability that we think is important as a scaling partnership here is not really well covered. We cannot do it, and the partners that we engage with now cannot do so. It can also help in deciding on who to work with. So here then there's a couple of examples of the unpacking that capability to relate and partner. So what sort of things would we be looking at then? And we didn't use this strictly to score on each one, but to give an idea. So it's about connecting, involving relevant actors, the ability to agree as partners, also to legitimize scaling efforts, etc. And so we did the same for each one. Again, not to use them strictly, but also to create some room for adaptation in the different cases, to translate it to the local conditions, to give them a good idea of what do we mean by a capability to resource and act. So not that they would be using these dimensions exactly the same, but to ensure that we're on the same page, that the kind of abilities that would be involved. So so about the capability to adapt and self-renew is very much about also the capability to go through a process of adaptive scaling, where maybe you start off with a particular approach, an innovation, and adjust it as you go through a process of seeing how this could go to scale. That happened also in the one related to sweet potatoes, that the innovation itself even got adjusted, or at least there was talking about basket of options, also showing that you could adapt it a little bit and not strictly follow the initial guidelines. So that can also be part of the scaling process to find out that if you start applying it elsewhere, you need to make some adaptations. So we did the same for all of the capabilities. And to make it work for us, for development results, that means, it's about the capability to think critically about, like, is this really contributing under different circumstances to sustainable development, or are we going too much for maybe a quick fix? We also, you can find it in the paper, try to compare it to a description in relation to a multi-level perspective. And then to put up some concluding messages. So, and then you can ask questions and say where maybe I cut some corners or wasn't clear. So before thinking about capacity to scale innovations, we need to think about how we operationalize that so that how does it make sure that it works for the sustainable development and is not overtaking sustainable development goal as if it's once we've decided that this is something good, that of course wherever you apply it and in whatever skill level you apply it at, it will work for sustainable development. So we found this framing of, and not just the framing, but partners of scaling instead of scaling partners, to invite your party to really be partners helps, and that also then it's important from the beginning, as we have probably you've talked also about, like from the beginning you have to think with skill in mind. Well, you would also need to think, we suggest, how can we be partners in scaling, and think about that not only as for like a second phase, but also earlier on in research discovery processes. So maybe that also means before partnering with scale in mind, you need to start partnering with sustainable development in mind, so that the order is correct. Then, I think I already shared that. So I think we often focus a lot on achieving fixed goals, targets through scaling. Also, how many will apply this, that, or the other. I think scaling the application of principles that needed to guide good practice, rather than just scaling things, but good farming practices, etc. Often they work, well, maybe more or at a deeper level. If you think about making scaling work for sustainable development. So in a standard scaling approach, getting more of the same, we may lose diversity. Proportions may be lost, appropriate proportions, as I said before. So there's, I think still there, as I started off with at the start, there's a tension between scaling thinking and resilience thinking. I'm not saying, I'm saying, not saying that necessarily, so that's it's either one or the other. I think you can make it a creative tension, but you have to, I would suggest, keep it in mind that there is tension, because scaling may undermine resilience characteristics. So then just I thought some last thoughts. Do not scale what's easy to scale, but what needs to scale. Current agricultural systems have been optimized over many years, including monocultures, etc. They work very well, but sometimes for a sustainable development perspective, other things need to be applied at scale more, but it will be difficult. In the beginning, they may not be as optimized as the existing dominant systems, and it will take some time. Like here in the place where I'm working now in Lelystad, we work with strip cropping. Well, that has not been optimized as much as the normal monocultures, but that doesn't say that it's a good way to go. So easily scaling will support the optimization of existing dominant systems. And I think the challenge is to make scaling also work for creating more room for different systems, like more diversified cropping systems. But it's difficult to get to that. The optimization will not be there at the start, so it will be more difficult, and you may not score, so to speak, in the eyes of donors as much. But still, it may very well need to be the way to go. So making scaling work for system change is then a thought. And then a last thought that I'd like to throw out. We tend to look for what's the best scaling option and then see that go to scale. I think also thinking along the lines of game theory, sometimes we need to maybe also work with a series of options where some are not the very best in our eyes, but maybe in the scaling process may turn out in some locations to work better than others. So not try to find the very best only, but also keep a range of options even into the scaling process because of the application under different conditions, which may turn out to work differently. Well, maybe I should just stop there and close this one down, and then
Thank you
open the
so
floor
much.
to questions and comments.
You're getting applause here, virtual applause and live applause. Thank you so much. Really thought-provoking. I'm thinking, wow, scaling is not automatically sustainable development, right? Doesn't always lead to that. Scaling bites with resilience, right, and diversity. Partners in scaling versus scaling partners. And I think then working a bit out that more capacities for scaling. No? So yeah, super interesting. So yeah, are there any questions from the room? Just raise your hand and then you can open your mic and or open your video. Johannes, please go ahead. Yeah, I saw you also wrote something in the chat already. Yeah, please go ahead, Johannes.
Sure. Hi, everybody. It's great to see you. And Seerp, it looks like
You're both wearing almost the same shirt,
exactly,
Johannes.
wearing the
And
same
I was
outfit
thinking
today.
because
Oh my God.
you're really the two scaling gurus to me. It's very interesting that you wear the same clothes. But anyway, sorry.
We're scaling red outfits, right? So that's funny. Anyway, thanks for a wonderful presentation and very thought-provoking. And I particularly thought your notion that that resilience and scaling may be in tension is an important one that in the way you presented that I hadn't thought about. So plus lots of other thoughtful ideas, especially on partnerships, which of course we always always argued that without partners no scaling, but you sort of dig a bit deeper here, and I need to look more at what you've written and how you explore this. And I've requested that we actually find those useful resources easily accessible, and of course your slides. So thank you very, very much. I guess I'm sort of putting myself in the shoes of what I call the proverbial practitioner. That's the guy, the gal who's out there trying to, manage his project, quote unquote, or, government official or whoever it is. And I'm a bit concerned that we're sort of overloading them with incredibly rich concepts that say, thou shalt do X, Y, and Z. It isn't just 10 commandments. If you add up everything we tell them they should do when thinking about scaling, there are 100, 1,000 commandments. And in the end, my fear is that and that's on top of everything else they've got to worry about. All the technical stuff, the making sure the money doesn't get absconded with by whoever, whatever it is. So I'm sort of worried that we're losing our audience, which is, the people on the ground whom now you're in some ways closer to them than I am. And maybe you have an answer to how do we keep this practical? How do we keep this, and convey the core messages that we have to share, which we agree, I think rightly think are terribly important, that we feel that they actually get heard and implemented. Now, Florence, I see you there. Hi, Florence. You made a comment back saying, "Oh, don't worry, the people are able to absorb complex problems and so on." But to be honest, when I think about my sort of former colleagues in the World Bank, who are pretty smart people, you know, basically they got too many of these complex or sort of new ideas that we're throwing on them. They just shut down, in my experience. Yeah. They say, forget it. I've got to deliver my project, and I'm going to do whatever I know best, and you go and do your thing, and I'm going to do my thing. So I'm overstating it, obviously, but let me challenge you a bit here. So how do we keep it simple, and how do we convey core ideas that people can really work and run with when they go and do their projects, quote unquote?
Yes, thank you very much. And and you're completely right. This presentation would not be useful, appropriate for quite a few practitioners. And actually, myself, I changed job like some 2 years ago. I going more to work in plant sciences, in where I would be confronted more with the practical side. Also because I recognize that I need to get into grips with how things are happening on the ground. So working with farmer groups, etc. So I purposefully put myself in that position, and also realizing from that context, this is the background thinking, but it would need to be translated, brought down to something digestible and handleable, manageable. But you need people, thought leaders maybe, to now from time to time inspire along these lines and bring in their thoughts, but not all at once. And in terms of those lists of like what capabilities and putting it in all the different abilities, dimensions, that's not for practitioners. It's more to develop a kind of way of engaging in the process, but then bringing it down. So it depends on who you're talking to. So this presentation is for a particular audience. I hope it was not too rough. But practitioners, indeed, we have something to deliver, and this needs to go to scale. So there I will just bring in bits and pieces from, say, out of this presentation. I'll throw in some thoughts on, say, okay, one day I'll zoom in on the resilience side. Like how does this work for the resilience characteristics? And another day I may talk about like, okay, but if we have to be in this together, who will deal with what sort of issues, what sort of capabilities do we need to make this work in a proper way? So I would cut it up in bits and pieces, but I do recognize that in many cases people feel overloaded. It's already difficult enough to just get our job done, and then you're asking these critical questions. But then I think, yeah, it's like I said, there's a tension between resilience thinking and scaling thinking. There's a tension between critical thinking and also realizing that there are some realities, and that sometimes it's like, okay, let it go for now, because if I keep pushing it, there's also a job to be done. So I've also used in the past, I've used in a booklet the analogy of two people sitting on a what is it called, a tandem, like a bicycle with two people on it, and they're going up the mountain, and so finally they get at the top of the mountain, and then the one in front exclaims, "Oh, if I hadn't been pedaling so hard, we would have never got here." And then the person in the back says, like, "If I had not been braking so hard, we would have gone downhill just as fast." And that's sometimes the creative energy that you need to do with. Some people, they want to go fast and scale fast and just get it done. And you need those people, but you also need to have people who sometimes break a little bit and ask some critical questions. And if you only have people breaking, we get nowhere. But if you only get people who want to go fast in scaling, you may be, you know, flying out of the corner. So it's, I think, also finding a way of dealing with that creative tension there. Well, that would be my thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. You're getting also some support from Judy in the chat. I see. Frank, I saw your hand first, but I guess Florence, you are responding to this as well, right, Florence? Or do you have a different kind of? Yeah, Florence. Then maybe Florence, you go ahead first.
Oh, okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you well.
Yes, I just well, and maybe when we're talking about practitioners, maybe we have different definitions. When I think of the World Bank, I don't think of practitioners. In my world, when I'm thinking of practitioners, I'm thinking about the extension agents, the trainers that are on the ground working with the farmers. And in our experience over the last 25 years, helping farmers with fairly complex agroecology systems to adopt them, we've found that both the farmers and the extension agents who are helping them make this transition to agroecology are able to take on a fairly complex system and share it and spread it and adapt it to the individualized farms. And I think it's because we take several years for this process, which I think some might argue makes it inherently less scalable. But I feel like I see other systems where the similar amounts of time are invested in technologies like monocultures and like chemical inputs and things that are not sustainable in the long term. So yeah, I think it's just a matter of finding the way to make these more complex systems scalable. And then if we're talking about levels like the World Bank or something like that, then yes, maybe take a simple approach and say, okay, we're offering a package of ecological practices that collectively get this kind of productivity and this kind of food security and this kind of poverty reduction and this kind of carbon sequestration and this kind of biodiversity and sort of just in basic terms show what's provided and what outcomes are achieved. So I know for what it's worth, that's
yeah, I think that's an interesting perspective. Thanks. I don't know, Seerp, if you want to respond to that, or do we go to Frank?
Yeah, no, it's maybe just that in agroecology, indeed, that people are dealing with the 13 principles of agroecology. That's quite a package, and people can handle that kind of thinking. It's amazing, yeah.
Great. Frank, hi.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Hi, everyone. Hi, I know many of you. Seerp, I met you. I think you did an evaluation for the CG a few years ago. I remember meeting you then.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay, that's indeed okay, yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks. It's very good. I appreciate the presentation and framework, and I think many of us in research institutions can certainly use it to as we kind of reflect on thinking through our own scaling processes and so forth. So that's very good. I had kind of a question similar to and thought similar to Florence's and others too, because I noticed on your last slide too, you talked about, and throughout the presentation, the scaling, what are we scaling? Is it innovations or principles and other things too? And that's where agroecology comes in, of course, because I think, yeah, we're focused more on scaling principles and also really generally in NRM, I think that's the movement towards more of that because we realize the context specificity, but then that does put the much more, a much more needed capability then is the ability to really evaluate across options, more systems thinking amongst all the partners along who are involved in the scaling. And Florence talked about some successes they had, but yeah, it's a slow. I think it is naturally going to be a slower process and to do it. But then I wanted to bring up one other capability because one of the first forays I had into scaling was with this NGO called Academy for Educational Development, which is now part of FHI 360, but they developed a scale methodology, and for them, it was so much about communication. So we haven't heard that too well, coming out, but I was wondering if that is covered by one of your larger ones, because I do think that that's a big issue all along, with amongst partners and with the beneficiaries and all of that. Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely, that one is critical, but we would put it on the capability to relate. Communication as a way of relating.
Okay.
So it's a subset of that. But
Yeah.
but I would agree that you could almost make it capability in itself, because it's absolutely critical. Yeah.
Yeah. Good.
Great,
But
Margaret.
but maybe by putting it under relate is also clarifying the purpose of communication. That's why we put it under there.
Got it. Thanks.
Hi, Margaret. Nice to see you.
Hi, Leonard. Long time.
Long time, yeah. Please go ahead, Margaret.
Very interesting, and I simply couldn't agree more with your findings and recommendations. But I agree certainly also with the discussion points which were raised by Johannes and Florence and Frank now. I see 2 points where really action is needed. One, you said first partnering with sustainable development in mind before partnering with scale in mind. This is very important in my opinion, because okay, I'm mainly working for GIZ, a little bit for other partners as well. My background is not research, but really I'm a practitioner in development cooperation. Currently GIZ is developing on ideas how to give recommendations to the BMZ, our Ministry for Cooperation, with regard to transition of rural economies, exactly what you are discussing. The biggest point, I think, in it is the ambition. As you say, scaling, it's about numbers. So what we need to develop, in my opinion, is messages that we bring down from the short-term ambition to the long-term sustainability, as you say, exactly. But we really need good messages for different types of projects, in my opinion. So this would be about evidence. So how can we create evidence databases for different types of project approaches, different types of innovations, which would make sense to be scaled up? For that one, for the evidence, we need to look more as we did in the past, apart from certainly also looking into changes which we want to achieve, does it pay back for those ones who are implementing it? So the economic side of the sustainability approach. Certainly also social and environmental, that's for sure, but we forgot too often about economics, and especially thinking economics from the onset and not at the end of the process. Once we say we want to scale up. This is the one side. Okay, we also need to have incentives for the intermediaries, public and private institutions, which are supposed to accompany the process of scaling and introducing innovations. This was the first point, first partnering with the sustainable development in mind, and in my opinion, most governments, national governments, but also international development organizations haven't got sustainability really in mind. They have short-term change or short-term numbers in mind. So we need to develop messages. The second point, which is very important, you were discussing the complexity. And you said digestible and manageable. They need to, the complexity has to be broken down into digestible and manageable approaches, let's say. In my opinion, systems change may have to take place either at local level, and then I think we can break down the complexity. Or it could be at national level, regional level, ECOWAS region, I don't know what. And there we need instruments, in my opinion, how to break down complexity. And in this line of thinking, it's also the point Johannes was mentioning, who can accompany it? And I would call people scaling coaches. And we haven't got profiles for that one. Working with GIZ, value links at the 10, 12, 15 years ago was the very same issue. Did we have the profiles? No, we didn't have the profiles. 10 years later, we have the profiles of people who can accompany. I'm working a lot on contract farming, and we have expert pools for coaching private companies and their networks of suppliers to coach them through to the very complex also. It's very complex contract farming to the process. And I think that's what we need. Not one type, it depends certainly also on the type of innovations which need to be scaled. Thank you.
Well,
Thanks.
there's a lot of things
That's a
that you said.
handful.
Maybe just to link to that last point, also looking at the time. So an important part in those in the process in which we developed this partners in scaling approach, scaling champions, they were there. They were part of the RTB, the Roots, Tubes, Bananas scaling fund. And the scaling champions, they were critical in the process. They were kind of process facilitators. They were key. Yeah, so, and we, if I'm not mistaken, we have discussed them also because it's already some time ago that we wrote the paper. But I think we discussed also in a paragraph on how their role is part of those capabilities in scaling.
Yeah. Good. Nico, you had your hand up. I'm not sure if you still want to have the floor.
Thank you, Leonard. This is Nicoletta. I'm a colleague of Leonard. I just felt like giving a reaction on the element, but it's been already very much touched. I come from 20 years of working with NGO in very remote areas, and I'm transition now working in the CGR. And I have no doubt that practitioner, but most importantly, people, farmers, and facilities and institutions can absorb complexity, but it's about how we engage them. This has been a very well already unpacked by previous interventions. So thank you.
All right, great. Johannes? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Seerp.
Well, I just saw a thing about a question about the scaling champions. No, they were not, I think that's how we call them, scaling champions. They were not early adopters or anything. They were the ones who guided the process, the interactions, kind of process facilitators. That's what their role was. And they are the ones that I would say would need to have this background thinking on scaling in mind, even though you can't maybe share that with everyone that you're working with as partners, but those are key people who can, with this kind of thinking in mind, can then see where to chip in what kind of messages.
Very funny message. Thanks, Florence. Thank you so much. Johannes, the last question to you.
I think I like where this conversation is going, because I think, we shouldn't, and I shouldn't have downplayed the ability of practitioners, whoever they are, to absorb complexity. I mean, I found when I worked with project officers in the World Bank or in UNDP or whatever, since that's my universe where I mostly do my work, that they're actually totally able to understand it, and and they'd love to do it. The problem is when they get to do their job, they just find they don't have the time, they don't have the incentives. Yeah, they have conceptually the ability to do it, but they don't. It just doesn't fit. It's a round peg into a square hole, and it just doesn't fit into the way the institutions are doing their business. Now, I recognize that is the bad old donors that I'm struggling with to try and change their business, and we have a separate exercise going on this, hopefully in our community practice. But you're right. I mean, at the farmer, and if you are able to engage in this long-term way in which France, for example, is engaging in supporting farmers, extension agencies, and so on, doing their stuff, I'm sure there is a lot of ability to deal with complexity, as long as we outsiders are trying to help do it in the right way, as you, Seerp, tried to indicate. Now, I want to raise another quick point, though, and this is, I'm struck by the fact that much of our conversation is around what Arne Hartmann, when we did our paper originally in 2008 about scaling, defined as what we call avoiding type 2 error, namely the error of scaling badly or scaling wrongly or scaling suboptimally or whatever. And all of the discussion is, and it's a great discussion to have, because ultimately that's what we should be discussing, namely how to do it right, how to do scaling right. What I'm struck by the fact, though, is that when I think about scaling and where I see the problem still, is the type 1 error, that people don't think enough about scaling at all, that they basically into one-off projects, into short-term, short-termism, whether it's donors or whether it's governments or whether it's, to some extent, yes, even maybe NGOs, although they, in my experience, tend to do better in this regard, much better than many others do. But so I just want to put out there that you're right. You're working on the right frontier, which is, avoiding type 2 errors. But I'm worried that we've too many on the ground and too many development actors are actually still worrying about innovation, and not worrying enough about scaling, sustainable, for sustainable impact, scaling. So innovation for sustainable impact is the way I phrase it these days. Not just scaling, but innovation for sustainable impact. And now, I still worry that not enough people are into the sustainable scaling bit of it.
But
Maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. Let me
could the
stop
two
there.
be connected, maybe, that because of the type 2 error, as you mention it, that because of not getting to grips with actually the various issues that need to be considered, that also the type 1 error is maybe made more, because actually basically we don't have a good mindset on how to engage with it properly. So then also the type 1 error gets made. Anyway, maybe the two could be connected.
Okay.
Be, yeah.
I'm looking at the time. We're a bit over time. Thank you so much. Gabi, also thank you for making this possible and the last minute changes that we had to make. I think this was a great session. We're gonna upload your presentation and this video and also the links to some of the papers that you mentioned on the website. I think also, Frank, you mentioned something that was interesting that we could put in the chat later on maybe. And yeah, then we can watch the video back. I think we will see Team Red popping up again. I think we saw my son walking in and we saw some clean offices. So yeah, I think it was a memorable session apart from the content as well. And thank you so much, Seerp.
You're very
Thanks for
welcome.
organizing
Thanks,
us,
Thanks.
Leonard.
Yeah,
Leonard,
thank
you do a
you.
great job in keeping it going. So keep working
you.
it going. We're really thankful.
Mhm.
Thank you so much, Team Red.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.